They were burial grounds for the Hudson's Bay Company. They were indigenous burial grounds, of course. But it was 1855 when the governor, James Douglas, decided that a new cemetery should be built, and that was downtown. It's now a park called Pioneer Square, but that got too crowded and it was being built up around, and so in 1872 the city decided they needed a cemetery that was way out in the country, where they wouldn't be bothered by anybody, where there was room to expand, and they were looking for well-drained soil because Pioneer Square had the disadvantage of being filled with clay, and that meant it was tough to dig a grave, and if you did dig a grave and it rained, the grave would fill with water like a well and it wouldn't drain out, and so they actually had to float the coffins and sink them down into the water. It was horrible. And so this site was going to be everything they wanted: space, country, well-drained soil. Well, that was 1872, and a woman by the name of Isabella Ross, whose husband had worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. In fact, he was the one who built Fort Victoria in 1843, but he died the following year. Charles Ross was his name. Well, 10 years later, she had moved away but came back to Victoria when the land had been surveyed. Treaties, the Douglas treaties had been made, and then the land was surveyed and it was up for sale, £1 an acre, and she had enough money to buy 99 acres of land. And this was part of her property. And it stretched from here, that way, for those who know Victoria, Ross Bay, the body of water just here, and then around the corner into Gonzales Bay, and then Harling Point. All of that was her property, and Gonzales Hill was part of hers as well. So it was a huge piece of property. Now, it wasn't all arable, Gonzales Hill, a solid rock, but nonetheless, she did try to farm it, and her farmhouse was just a short distance over here, just that way. It's gone now. And anyway, when the gold rush happened in 1858, and it seems that Isabella Ross was a little bit hard up, she needed to sell some property to make some money. She sold a chunk of her property to Robert Burnaby. Robert Burnaby. Burnaby is named after him, but he was a businessman in Victoria. And he bought this, he built a farmhouse just a short distance over there. And anyway, he got sick in the early 1870s, just around the time the city of Victoria was looking for a new site. And so they bought 13 acres of Robert Burnaby's property. The first part of Ross Bay Cemetery was built on 13 acres of what had been Robert Burnaby's stump farm. There were still big stumps all around. He wasn't a very good farmer. Isabella Ross was still living over there and on her part of the farm, and she eventually died and was buried here at Ross Bay Cemetery, and later her estate was divided up and became housing in the neighborhood that is now South Fairfield and the neighborhood around Gonzales Bay. So 1872, the city bought the property. There was one burial at the very end of 1872, kind of an unofficial burial, and then it opened up in 1873 and was the main city cemetery for a long time, up until the 1920s. To start, I actually moved to Victoria in 1960 as an 11-year-old from Ontario. I'd never seen a cemetery before that I could remember. My family moved right across the street from this cemetery, and so it became my backyard. And I got to know it. Names popped up, Sir James Douglas and various others that, I was going to Sir James Douglas School. So suddenly the names of people became known to me. And as I studied history, of course, it was mostly the famous people: Sir James Douglas, Billy Barker, Sir Matthew Bailey Begbie, Amor de Cosmos, people like that. They were the ones who probably were best known. And when I started doing that guidebook back in the early 1980s, I began putting all my information together and thinking, okay, what's going to be interesting? Well, the interesting people, the great men at the time, and some women. Today we try to include far more women than I did in my guidebook back in those early days. Monuments. Turns out that there are beautiful monument styles here and many well-known monument makers. The Historic Guide to Ross Bay Cemetery was my first book, and I've written half a dozen other books in between, including the biography of Sir James and Lady Douglas, who's buried here at Ross Bay Cemetery. But I also I began doing walking tours in my retirement. I had done walking tours once in a while as something to do. So if the Historical Society was doing a fundraiser, sure, John will do a tour, that sort of thing. But when I retired, in 2004, I decided maybe I can do some more walking tours. And I did not realize it was going to end up into a full-time job. My company is called Discover the Past. And we do ghost tours, ghostly walks, very popular. We do history tours in downtown, many neighborhoods as well. They're called Discovery Walks. And Chinatown was going to be one of the ones on our program, and it turned out to be a very popular one. And as often happens, somebody said, well, is there a good book? Well, there were a few books, but nothing that really brought it all together. Oh, why don't you write one? Oh, okay. And so what I had in mind was something rather thin, a little pamphlet maybe, that I could give to people or sell to people after one of my Chinatown tours. So it became a 20-year project, and the book ended up being a very thick tome, probably too thick, 500 pages, and it's only really taking a thin slice of the surface. But it discovered Chinatown in a very broad way from 1858 until more or less the present day. And hopefully it's going to open up the idea of Chinatown as a place that other people can study in more depth on whatever topic they might be interested in. So it was really my own project, but encouraged by people who had taken my tour in Chinatown. There are lots of prominent people buried at Ross Bay Cemetery. Sir James Douglas is one of the most prominent. At least he's known to many people in British Columbia. And his wife, Lady Amelia Douglas, often gets neglected, but she has a very important story herself. And it's probably one of the biggest monuments at the cemetery. He died in 1877. And many people think that because the monument is so shiny and in good shape, it's new. But it's not. It's from 1877. The family ordered it from a monument company in San Francisco. And in a private collection in Vancouver is the watercolor proof that was sent up by the monument company so the family could give its approval for this. And I've seen it, and we know that this is exactly what the monument looked like when it was erected in 1878, so just a short time after he died. When I wrote my book, Historic Guide to Ross Bay Cemetery, it came out in '83, I'm sure at that time people were not leaving stuff on Emily's grave. But sometime between then and now, it's been discovered, and so we'll find pine cones, seashells, art supplies, so markers and all sorts of things. Somebody's put down a monkey, and all sorts of, and oh, I see, what's this? A coconut. Is that a coconut? Yes. Why would you put a coconut on there? I don't know. And even a little angel. Yeah, people put all sorts of stuff, and even occasionally some small coins. And things that they've done, painted stones and so on. Anything to remember Emily. She's actually been featured, her grave was featured on NHK, the Japanese national television network, and they were doing a series about Victoria, and they wanted to include Emily. And they came and they brought a huge bouquet of flowers, and it was a major part of their program to pay homage to Emily Carr because she's such an icon.